They thought no help was coming. Then a human battleship came howling out of the void. I want you to know that I had given up. I had looked at the numbers, the distances, the silence on every frequency, and I had made the cold and simple calculation that nobody was coming. Not the Halori, not the Juon, not the Velesi, nobody. And so, on the 6th day of our flight through the pale corridor, I reached across my console on the bridge of the Whisper of Dawn and shut down the beacon with my own hands. 40,000 of my people were on that convoy. 12 unarmed transport ships, carrying every Rathani who had made it off our homeworld, before the Dravari burned the last city. Families, children, engineers and teachers and farmers and poets, all of them packed into cargo holds that were never meant to carry living beings, breathing recycled air that tasted like rust, eating rations that would run out in 9 days. Some of them had nothing, not a blanket, not a change of clothes, not a single possession from the lives they had been living 2 weeks before. They had run with what they could carry, and most of them could not carry much. I was the communications officer aboard the Whisper of Dawn, the convoy's lead ship. It was my job to listen. For 6 days, that was all I did. I sat at my console on the dimly lit bridge, cycling through every frequency and every band, straining my ears and my instruments for a voice, a signal, a single word that meant someone out there had heard us and was coming. All I heard was silence, the deep, indifferent silence of empty space. The Dravari Dominion had taken our world in less than a week. They are an insectoid species, tall and heavily armored, with mandibles that click when they speak, and compound eyes like polished black glass. They do not conquer for territory or for glory. They conquer for labor. They call it harvesting. They sweep through the outer systems and collect what they call soft species, civilizations without military capability, without warships, without the will or the means to fight back. They take us to their deep space mining colonies. They separate the adults from the children, because children are easier to condition when there are no parents to remind them of who they used to be. My people, the Rathani, are exactly the kind of species the Dravari look for. We are tall and slender, with delicate bone structures and skin that produces bioluminescence, soft patterns of light that shift with our emotions. We are scientists, musicians, diplomats. Our civilization is 10,000 years old, and in all those centuries, we have never built a weapon of war. Not one. Our greatest cultural achievement is the resonance, a form of collective singing that can move an audience to tears across species barriers. We resolve conflict through formal submission. When a stronger power threatens us, we yield. We compose surrender documents with exquisite grammar. We bow with perfect form. Standard Galactic Emergency Protocol. I broadcast on every available frequency, in every language in my translation bank, to every species with a presence within reasonable range. The message was simple, clear, desperate. We are civilians. We are unarmed. We are being hunted. Please help. The Halori Concord responded within 3 hours. They are the largest democratic body in the sector, nearly 200 member worlds, a combined fleet of 4,000 warships, the most powerful military force on this side of the galactic arm. Their message was polite and carefully worded. They expressed deep concern for the Rithani people. They condemned the actions of the Dravari Dominion in the strongest possible language. They would raise the matter at their next legislative session, which was scheduled for 11 days from now, but they could not intervene directly. Direct military action against the Dravari would be interpreted as an act of war, and the Concord was not prepared to accept that risk at this time. At this time, I remember that phrase, as if there might be a better time to save 40,000 lives, as if the children in our cargo holds could wait for a legislative session. The June Trade League responded next. Their message was shorter and, in its way, more honest. They said the Dravari Dominion was a significant trading partner, and they could not jeopardize that economic relationship for a species that offered no comparable commercial value. They wished us well. They wished us well, and then they went back to counting their profits. The Velesi Commonwealth did not respond for 2 full days. When their message finally arrived, it was a single line. I did not blame them. Not then, not now. This is how the galaxy works. It has always worked this way. The strong do what they wish. The weak endure what they must. Every Rithani child learns this before they learn to sing. It is the first lesson, and the hardest. There was one species I sent the distress call to that never responded at all. The humans. I included them almost as an afterthought, adding their communication frequencies to the broadcast list, because protocol required me to contact every spacefaring civilization within signal range. The humans are a young species, barely 200 standard years into interstellar travel. Their territory is small, tucked into an unremarkable corner of the galactic arm, a handful of colony worlds orbiting average stars. The galactic database describes them as a minor regional power with limited military capability. The cultural assessment uses the phrase spirited but insignificant. Nobody takes them seriously. I did not expect a response, and I did not receive one. I barely thought about them after that. I had other things to think about. On the 4th day of our flight, the water recyclers on Transport 6 failed. It took 12 hours to repair them, and during that time, 2,000 Rithani were without clean water. I coordinated the emergency transfer of water reserves from other ships, talking on the comm for 9 hours straight until my voice gave out. When the recyclers came back online, I collapsed at my station and slept for 2 hours. Nobody woke me. Nobody needed to. The next crisis was already waiting. On the 5th day, we lost a child, a boy, 4 years old, whose name I later learned was Ren. He had been sick before the evacuation, a respiratory condition that needed medication we did not have. His mother carried him to the medical station in the cargo hold, but there was nothing the medics could do with the supplies on hand. He died in her arms while the convoy flew on through the dark. His bioluminescence faded to nothing, and then he was gone. His mother's grief light turned a shade of violet so deep it was almost black. I have never seen that color before or since. I hope I never do. They had been tracking us the entire time, following our engine signatures through the pale corridor, with the patient inevitability of predators who know their prey cannot escape. At our current speed, they would intercept the convoy in 14 hours. I reported the contact to Captain Torath on the bridge. He is an old Rithani, tall even by our standards. His bioluminescence faded to a dim, steady blue with age. He has served on civilian ships for 50 years. He has never fired a weapon. He has never needed to. He listened to my report without expression, his face perfectly still, and then he called the Elder Council into emergency session. We had no weapons. We had no allies. We had no options. Elder Maven, the senior voice on the council, a woman of 112 years, whose light still burned with quiet clarity, proposed a formal resolution of surrender. The vote was unanimous. 12 voices, all in agreement. We would yield. We would submit. We would bow our heads and hope that the act of submission would buy our people some small mercy. I had studied the formal language, the ancient phrases of capitulation, the precise grammar of defeat. I had always assumed it would feel dignified when the moment arrived, noble even, a final act of grace in the face of overwhelming force. It did not. It felt like swallowing something sharp. My hands shook so badly that I could barely enter the text. The light patterns on my skin were flickering between gray and pale yellow, the colors of despair and nausea. Suli, the young navigation officer at the next station, looked at me with wide eyes but said nothing. There was nothing to say. I composed the message: formal surrender, 40,000 civilians. We yield. A single sentence, translated by the computer into flat, toneless Rithani. Something that does not have a name. I stared at the words on my screen for a long time. Around me, the bridge was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Torath stood at the viewport with his back to the crew, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, his bioluminescence went completely dark. Every trace of light, extinguished. He stood there like a shadow against the stars, and he said nothing, and his silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. 13 hours and 42 minutes until contact. I looked at the distress beacon on my console. It was still transmitting, still sending our cry into the void, still begging the empty dark for help that would never come. The green indicator light pulsed on and off, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I hated it. I hated its persistence. I hated its stupid, pointless hope. I reached out and turned it off. The light went dark. The beacon went silent, and I felt something inside me go silent with it. Not grief, not rage, something deeper and quieter, something I did not have a word for in any of the 412 words my language has for different qualities of light. The feeling you get when you realize that the universe is very large and very cold, and you are very small, and nobody is listening, and nobody is coming, and the dark will swallow you, and no one will notice. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Around me, the bridge crew sat at their stations and waited for the Dravari to come. Some of them were dimly glowing in soft greens and blues, the colors of prayer. Some were dark, like Torath. Suli was crying without sound, her skin flashing in rapid bursts of white that she could not control, an involuntary stress response that looked like a distress signal all by itself. I did not comfort her. I did not comfort anyone. I sat in my chair and I waited, and I thought about the children in the cargo holds below me, and I thought about Ren, who had already died, and I thought about his mother, whose grief light was so dark it looked like a wound in the air, and I tried very hard not to think about what the Dravari would do when they arrived. I had turned off the beacon. I had stopped listening. The universe was silent, and I had accepted that silence as final. The bridge was running on minimal lighting to conserve power, so dim that I could see the bioluminescence of my own hands reflected in the screen. Most of the crew had gone below to be with their families. Only Torath, Suli, and I remained. The ship was quiet. The stars outside the viewport did not move. The air smelled like recycled metal and old fear. And then every sensor on the bridge activated at once. The sound was like nothing I had ever heard on a civilian vessel. Every alarm, every warning system, every proximity detector screaming at the same time, in a cascade of tones that hit my ears like a physical blow. The console in front of me lit up in a wall of red and white alerts. Suli jerked upright in her chair with a sharp cry that cut through the noise. Tomath spun from the viewport, his skin flaring with sudden blue-white light so intense it threw shadows across the bulkhead. Something had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel. Close. Dangerously, recklessly close. So close that the shockwave of its arrival rattled the hull plating of every ship in the convoy. I felt the whisper of dawn shudder beneath me like a living thing, felt the deck vibrate under my feet, heard the structural supports groan with a sound that I felt in my bones. I grabbed the edge of my console with both hands and pulled myself forward, fighting to read the sensor data through the chaos of cascading alerts. My hands were shaking again, but this time, it was not despair. It was something else. Something raw and electric and sharp that ran up my spine and made every luminescent cell in my skin fire at once. My first thought was the Dravari. They had sent an advance force. They were early. The end had come ahead of schedule, and we had not even had time to say our goodbyes. But the readings were wrong. The mass signature was wrong. The energy output was wrong. The electromagnetic profile, the thermal signature, the gravitational displacement, all of it was wrong. This was not a Dravari ship. This was not anything I recognized. I filtered the sensor data through 3 different analysis protocols, stripping away the noise, trying to get a clear image. It took me nearly 30 seconds, and even then, the picture was distorted because the object was running so many electronic warfare systems that it was smearing itself across 3 different sensor bands simultaneously. My instruments could not decide what they were looking at. The ship, because it was a ship, I could tell that much, was actively and aggressively confusing everything that tried to scan it. It was not hiding. It was not cloaking. It was doing something more unusual. It was being loud and unclear at the same time, like a creature that wanted you to know it was there but did not want you to know exactly what it was. When I finally assembled enough data to form a partial image, I stopped breathing. It was a single vessel, one ship. But it was enormous, nearly the size of a Dravari attack cruiser, massing somewhere in the range of 900,000 metric tons, and its shape was like nothing in any database I had ever accessed. Where most galactic species build ships with smooth curves and elegant lines, designs that reflect cultural values of harmony and balance, this thing was the opposite. It was blocky, angular, brutal. It looked like it had been designed by someone who had never heard of aesthetics and did not care to learn. The hull was a maze of flat surfaces and sharp angles, covered in antenna arrays, sensor clusters, and weapon turrets. So many weapon turrets. They ran along the spine and flanks of the ship in rows, dozens of them, like teeth in a jaw that had far too many teeth. The armor plating was thick and uneven, some of it clearly newer than the rest, welded on over older damage in overlapping layers, like scar tissue on skin that had been wounded and healed and wounded again. It was the ugliest ship I had ever seen, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever laid eyes on. The transponder signal cut through the electronic noise like a blade through smoke, clear, unencrypted, broadcast on an open channel for anyone and everyone to read. My bioluminescence was cycling through colors I could not control, yellow and white and blue and green all at once, a light show of pure confusion. Terran, human, the minor regional power, the spirited but insignificant species from the unremarkable corner of the galactic arm. They had sent a battleship. Captain Torath crossed the bridge in 2 strides and leaned over my console, his face centimeters from the display. His voice was low and tight, controlled in the way that old Rathani control themselves when they are afraid. "What is it?" "Human warship," I said. My voice did not sound like my own. It sounded thin and strange, like it was coming from very far away. "One vessel, Valor-class battleship, designation Oathkeeper." Before I could answer, before I could tell him that I did not know why the humans had sent anything at all, because they had never responded to our distress call, and we had no alliance, and no treaty, and no connection to them whatsoever, the communications array chimed. "Incoming transmission. Audio only, no visual. Wideband frequency, meaning it was intended for everyone to hear." I opened the channel with hands that would not stop trembling. A voice filled the bridge. A human voice, speaking in accented but perfectly clear Galactic standard. It was a woman. Her tone was calm, steady, almost casual, as if she were checking in on a routine matter, rather than arriving unannounced in a crisis zone, 6 days from the nearest human territory. Sorry for the late arrival. You were a long way out. We are here now. Silence on the bridge. Total, absolute silence. Suli had her hands over her mouth. Torath was standing perfectly still, his skin blazing with blue-white light. I stared at the console, my mind racing to process what I was hearing. 6 days ago. They had heard us 6 days ago, the moment I first sent the signal, and they had been coming ever since, crossing the distance at what must have been their maximum speed, burning through fuel and pushing their engines to the limit, racing across the gap between their space and ours, for 6 straight days, to reach a species they had no obligation to help. I found my voice. It came out hoarse and uneven, but it came. Oathkeeper, this is Whisper of Dawn. We acknowledge your signal. We are a civilian convoy, 12 ships, 40,000 refugees. We are unarmed and without military escort. We are being pursued by Dravari military forces. 7 attack cruisers in hunting formation. Estimated intercept in 8 hours. A brief pause. Then Captain Elliot. Understood, Whisper of Dawn. What is the current status of your distress beacon? My skin flushed dark with shame. I knew the color. Every Rathani knows it. The deep, muddy gray-brown of embarrassment and guilt. I had turned the beacon off. I had given up. It has been deactivated, Oathkeeper, I said. We believed no response was coming. Another pause, shorter this time. And then, in a tone that was not angry, but was utterly certain, Captain Elliot said 2 words that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Turn it back on. as if she were informing me, gently but firmly, that giving up was not a decision I was permitted to make. Not while she was here. Not while her ship was in the sky. That small, stubborn heartbeat that I had hated and silenced, beating again in the dark. Captain Elliot's response came without hesitation, without caveat, without the careful diplomatic hedging that I had learned to expect from every other species in the galaxy. No fleet. No authorization. We heard your call and we came. That is all. Torath leaned over my shoulder. Ask them if they understand the tactical situation. 7 cruisers, 1 ship. I explained the odds. 7 Dravari attack cruisers, each one a proven combat vessel, with a full weapons complement and an experienced crew. 1 human battleship, however formidable, could not reasonably be expected to hold against those numbers. Perhaps the wisest course of action would be for the Oathkeeper to withdraw and return with additional forces. longer than any of the others. I could hear faint background sounds from the Oathkeeper, the hum of systems, the murmur of crew voices, the distant thrum of engines running hot. Something quieter than either. Something settled and immovable, like stone at the bottom of the ocean. 7? Whisper of Dawn, Captain Elliot continued. Maintain your current heading and speed. Do not deviate from your course. Do not alter your formation. Keep your people calm. We will handle the rest. Then she said, Oathkeeper out, and the channel closed. I sat at my console and stared at the sensor display. The icon representing the Oathkeeper was moving, not toward the convoy, not into an escort position, not into any defensive formation that I recognized from my training, or my studies, or any tactical database I had ever accessed. The human battleship was accelerating directly toward the Dravari fleet, alone, at full thrust, straight into the path of 7 warships that outgunned it, and outnumbered it 7-1. Suli whispered from her station. Her voice was barely audible. What are they doing? I watched the sensor display. The Oathkeeper's icon was pulling away from the convoy, a single bright point of light racing across the screen toward 7 red ones. It was not slowing down. It was not changing course. It was not hesitating or circling or positioning for advantage. It was charging, straight and fast and true, like an arrow fired at a target that the archer had already decided to hit. You maintain distance. You preserve your options. You engage at range where your weapons are effective and your exposure is minimal. You withdraw when losses become unacceptable. They were doing something that I had no framework to understand, something that looked, from the outside, like madness. They were charging, one ship against 7, and they were getting faster. I do not know, I told Suli. I do not know what they are doing, but somewhere in the deepest part of my mind, in the place where instinct lives and reason cannot reach, I was beginning to suspect something that I did not yet have words for. They knew exactly what they were doing, and the Dravari, who had never fought humans before, who had read the same galactic database that I had, who believed they were chasing cargo, had no idea what was coming. The Oathkeeper raced ahead of the convoy at a speed that our civilian sensors could barely track. The human ship was fast, impossibly fast for something that size, and it was pouring energy into its engines with what seemed like complete disregard for mechanical limits, or fuel consumption, or anything resembling caution. Our engineering specialist, a quiet Rathani named Thedan, who had been called back to the bridge to monitor the situation, ran the numbers on the Oathkeeper's engine output and told me, in a voice tight with disbelief, that the human ship was operating at a power level that would burn out a Rathani vessel of equivalent size in less than an hour. The Oathkeeper showed no signs of strain, it just kept accelerating. I monitored the communication channels obsessively, switching between frequencies, listening for anything, from either side, that might tell me what was about to happen. The Dravari fleet was still closing from the opposite direction. Their formation had shifted slightly, sensors adjusting to the unexpected approach of the lone vessel, but they had not changed course or reduced speed. 7 cruisers against 1. The math was clear to them. Whatever this strange, ugly ship thought it was doing, it did not matter. At 6 hours to intercept, I picked up a transmission from the Dravari command ship. It was directed at the Oathkeeper on an open frequency, unencrypted, meant to be heard. The Dravari commander identified himself as Fleet Captain Kresh Vorath. His voice, translated by the computer, was sharp and flat, the clicking of his mandibles providing a staccato rhythm beneath the words. Unidentified vessel, you are interfering with a lawful military operation of the Dravari Dominion. Alter course immediately, or you will be classified as hostile and engaged. The Oathkeeper did not respond. Vorath transmitted again 5 minutes later. Same message, same demand, same tone of absolute authority. Silence from the humans. Vorath tried a third time. This time there was something different in his transmission. The clicking of his mandibles was faster, harder, almost stumbling over itself. I had studied enough Dravari communication patterns to recognize what that meant. He was not angry. He was confused. In his experience, in the experience of every Dravari commander for generations, no species had ever simply ignored a Dravari ultimatum. You responded. You negotiated. You submitted. You did not fly toward 7 attack cruisers in silence, as if the warning had not been spoken. The Oathkeeper kept coming, faster, closer, a single dot of light on the sensor display burning toward 7 red icons, like a torch falling into darkness. The Oathkeeper's electronic warfare systems, which had been running at a steady hum since the ship's arrival, suddenly intensified. The output spiked dramatically, and the ship's sensor signature bloomed outward, expanding and multiplying and splitting into ghost images. On our display, the single ship became 3, then 5, then 9. Each ghost was a perfect duplicate, moving in formation, radiating the same mass signature and energy profile as the original. The Dravari fleet reacted immediately. I watched their cruiser icons scatter on the sensor display as their tight hunting formation broke apart. Each cruiser was trying to identify the real threat, targeting a different ghost, spreading out across a wide area to cover the apparent approach of 9 warships instead of 1. They were chasing shadows, and while they chased, the real Oathkeeper slipped between them, using the confusion to close the distance and choose its angle of approach. Torath was watching the display. His bioluminescence was pulsing in a color I had never seen on him before, a deep, shimmering gold that I did not know how to interpret. His old eyes were sharp and focused. "Clever," he said quietly. It was the first word he had spoken in hours, and it hung in the air like the first note of a song. But the damage was done. The Dravari formation was scattered across a wide volume of space, their cruisers no longer in the tight, coordinated hunting pattern that gave them their tactical advantage. The Oathkeeper had used deception and speed to buy itself room and positioning, and it had used the time to get very, very close. Two ships closing on a collision course, neither one altering trajectory, neither one showing any sign of yielding. On the bridge of the Whisper of Dawn, every Rathani who could stand was present. Word had spread through the convoy by comm and whisper, and the wordless communication of bioluminescent patterns seen through viewport glass. 40,000 refugees were watching through whatever feeds they could access, from bridge displays to personal data pads, to the small view screens in the cargo holds where children sat on their parents' laps and stared at patterns of light they did not understand. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The entire convoy held its breath. Their encryption on that band was keyed to military protocols, but our civilian equipment operated on slightly different wavelengths and caught the edge of the signal. Weapons charged and locked, shield generators at maximum, engine output holding steady, damage control teams in position, medical standing by. It sounded like a machine at peak performance. Every part in place, every person doing exactly what they had trained for, ready for what was coming. And underneath the voices, barely audible, threaded through the background of every transmission like a second pulse, there was something else. Music. Someone on the Oathkeeper was playing music. I did not recognize it. It was rhythmic, driving, built around a pattern of percussion and a rising melody that climbed and did not stop. It was not soft. It was not soothing. It was fierce and fast and alive, and it pulsed through the communication channel like an extra heartbeat, like a war drum made of sound and joy. The humans were about to fight 7 warships, outnumbered and alone, and far from home, and someone on that ship had decided that what this moment needed was a song. I did not understand these beings. I did not understand them at all. 3 minutes to contact. The lead Dravari cruiser, the largest and most heavily armed ship in Vorath's fleet, was directly ahead of the Oathkeeper. Both vessels were accelerating toward each other. The gap between them was closing at a combined velocity that the sensor system could barely calculate. Captain Elliot's voice came through on the open channel one last time. Clear and calm and final. Not directed at us. Directed at the Dravari. Fleet Captain Vorath. This is your one and only warning. Break off your pursuit of the Rathani convoy and withdraw from this sector, or we will engage and we will not stop until you do. Captain Elliot did not answer the question. Instead, she said something that I did not fully understand at the time. Something that seemed simple on the surface, but that I have turned over in my mind every single day since, feeling its weight, its edges, its terrible and beautiful meaning. The Rathani called for help. We answered. What happens next is your choice, Captain Vorath. Choose well. Silence on the channel. 2 minutes. 1 minute. 30 seconds. The Oathkeeper fired first. I felt the shockwave through the sensors before I understood what I was seeing. massive electromagnetic launch systems running along the spine of the ship, like a backbone made of fury. They fired solid tungsten projectiles, dense rods of metal, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light by magnetic fields of staggering power. My sensors could not follow them. They could only register the moment of launch and the moment of impact, and the gap between those two moments was almost nothing. The first salvo hit the lead Dravari cruiser dead center, amidships, where the hull plating met the structural spine. The cruiser did not explode. That word is too small, too clean, too controlled for what happened. The ship came apart. The kinetic energy transferred by the impact was so vast, so concentrated, so far beyond anything the cruiser's structure was designed to withstand, that the vessel simply failed as an object. I watched on the sensor display as the largest warship in the Dravari fleet split into two separate pieces, each one tumbling away from the point of impact in opposite directions, trailing expanding clouds of fire and debris and frozen atmosphere. The wreckage scattered across a wide area, and the two nearest Dravari cruisers, too close to the point of impact, were peppered with shrapnel that tore through their outer hull plating like rain through paper. One shot, one salvo from one ship, and the flagship of the Dravari hunting fleet was gone. The bridge of the Whisper of Dawn was absolutely silent. Suli had both hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide, her skin flashing pure white. Torath stood motionless, his bioluminescence blazing so bright that it cast sharp-edged shadows across every surface. Theodan, the engineer, was gripping his console with both hands, his light flickering between colors so fast it looked like static. I could not process what I had just witnessed. A Dravari attack cruiser, a ship designed to withstand sustained fleet-level combat, built with armor rated for plasma impacts and particle beam strikes, crewed by hundreds of trained soldiers. Reduced to tumbling wreckage in less than a second, by a weapon that did not fire energy or plasma, or anything the galaxy considered sophisticated, it fired metal. Solid, simple, primitive metal, accelerated to a speed that made sophistication irrelevant. The void between the ships lit up with streaks and bursts of green and gold, a web of weapons fire so dense and concentrated that it seemed impossible for anything caught in it to survive. Direct hits. Multiple direct hits, hammering the human battleship from bow to stern. The Oathkeeper took them. Armor plating sheared away from the hull in molten sheets, glowing white-hot as it tumbled into space. Antenna arrays vaporized. A section of the port hull buckled inward, under a sustained particle beam, and then blew outward, venting atmosphere in a violent plume that crystallized instantly in the cold of the void. The ship staggered under the barrage, its trajectory shifting, its outline changing, as pieces of its outer structure were torn away. And it kept coming. It did not slow down. It did not turn. It did not retreat, or reposition, or do any of the things that tactical doctrine said a ship should do when taking that level of damage. It accelerated. It poured more power into its engines and drove straight through the barrage, straight into the teeth of the fire, and brought its weapons to bear on the second cruiser. Torath said something under his breath. A word in Old Rethani, from a dialect that has not been commonly spoken in 3,000 years. I had only ever seen it in ancient texts, in the chronicles of a time when my people still remembered what it meant to face something unstoppable. The word meant, roughly, that which does not care about its own body. It was used in the old stories to describe natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, forces that could not be reasoned with, could not be appeased, could not be made to stop. He was not wrong. The second Dravari cruiser tried to evade. It rolled hard to port and fired its engines at maximum thrust, trying to open the distance, trying to get away from this impossible thing that was bearing down on it. The Oathkeeper tracked the movement, adjusted its angle with a precision that spoke of targeting systems far more advanced than anyone had given the humans credit for, and fired a broadside at close range. The railgun slugs punched through the cruiser's shield array, as if it were not there. They hit the engineering section and kept going, passing through compartments and bulkheads and structural members without slowing down, leaving tunnels of destruction through the body of the ship. The cruiser's engines died. Its power grid failed. Every light on the ship went dark at once, and it began to drift, powerless, silent, a dead hulk of metal turning slowly in the void. 2 Dravari cruisers down in less than 3 minutes. The most powerful hunter-killer ships in the Dravari fleet, and the Oathkeeper had swatted them aside like insects. But the human ship was hurt. I could see that clearly on the sensor display. The port side was a ruin, armor stripped away to bare structure, compartments exposed to vacuum, internal systems flickering and failing. A lesser ship would have been destroyed by the damage it had already taken. A lesser crew would have disengaged. Instead, I watched the Oathkeeper do something that made every Rethani on the bridge gasp. It rolled. The entire battleship, all 900,000 tons of it, rotated on its central axis in a controlled, deliberate barrel roll that presented its undamaged starboard armor to the remaining Dravari ships. It was a maneuver that required extraordinary precision, split-second timing, and a crew that trusted each other with their lives. They were treating their massive warship like a fighter, like a small craft, spinning it in the middle of a pitched battle to keep fighting with whatever hull they had left. The 5 remaining Dravari cruisers had reformed into a tight defensive cluster, finally recognizing the threat for what it was and pulling together for mutual protection. They were firing continuously, all 5 ships pouring plasma and particle beams at the Oathkeeper in a sustained barrage that turned the space between them into a wall of energy and destruction. The Oathkeeper flew through it. I picked up another Dravari transmission. It was not from Fleet Captain Vorath. It was from the captain of one of the surviving cruisers, broadcasting to the rest of the fleet on their tactical channel. The translation was imperfect, the computer struggling with the rapid clicking of agitated Dravari speech, but the meaning was unmistakable. It is still coming. Why is it still coming? The Oathkeeper answered the question with action, not words. Launch bays along the dorsal spine of the ship cracked open, and dozens of small objects poured into the void. Drones. Autonomous combat drones, each one no larger than a Rathani shuttle pod, but fast and agile, and armed with precision weapons. They swarmed outward from the battleship in a spreading cloud, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they were controlled by a central intelligence, and they targeted the engine systems of the nearest Dravari cruisers. 2 more ships lost propulsion within minutes. The drones were surgical, striking specific systems with specific weapons, disabling drives and maneuvering thrusters and fuel lines with a selectivity that spoke of careful design. They were not trying to destroy the cruisers. They were crippling them, cutting their legs out from under them, leaving them stranded, unable to chase the convoy, unable to run, unable to do anything but drift and watch. They were trying to make it impossible for the Dravari to reach the convoy. Every tactical choice the Oathkeeper made was oriented toward one single objective: protecting 40,000 refugees, and everything that did not serve that objective was secondary. Even their rage was precise. The Oathkeeper closed on the 5th cruiser and engaged it in a point-blank exchange that was savage and brief and terrible to watch. Both ships fired everything they had at near-contact range, so close that the sensor display could barely distinguish between them. The Dravari cruiser lost its entire forward weapon array in the first exchange. The Oathkeeper lost a section of its upper hull that peeled away from the ship like bark from a tree, exposing decks and corridors to the vacuum, venting debris and atmosphere in a spreading cloud. But when the firing stopped, the Dravari cruiser was drifting with its power grid collapsing, and the Oathkeeper was still moving. Still coming, still fighting, still alive. 5 down, 2 remaining. The last 2 Dravari cruisers broke. There is no other word that fits. They did not retreat in good order. They did not withdraw tactically. They broke. The other turned and burned for Dravari territory at full speed, its engine signature flaring bright on the sensors as it pushed its drives past their rated limits. The Oathkeeper pursued the larger of the 2 for nearly 2 minutes. I watched its icon on the sensor display chased the fleeing cruiser across the screen, closing the distance with steady, implacable acceleration. Then it stopped. It let the ship go. It let that cruiser escape. I did not understand why until much later, until I had spent time with the humans and begun to learn how they thought. Captain Elliot let that ship go on purpose. She wanted it to reach Dravari space. She wanted the surviving crew to dock at their home port and walk into their commander's office and report, in detail, with shaking voices and clicking mandibles, exactly what had happened to 7 attack cruisers in the Pale Corridor. She wanted the story told. She wanted the Dravari High Command to hear it. She wanted every fleet captain and every admiral and every politician in the Dravari Dominion to know precisely what a single human battleship could do and was willing to do. She was not just winning a battle. She was sending a message, not with words or diplomacy or threats, with wreckage. The engagement lasted 11 minutes from the first shot to the last. 4 Dravari cruisers destroyed or crippled beyond any hope of repair. 2 disabled, their drives dead, their crews stranded in the dark. 1 fled, a 7-to-1 engagement, and the humans did not merely win, they dominated. They fought with a sustained ferocity that I had no reference point for, no framework to understand, no word in any of the languages I spoke to describe. They did not fight like a species, trying to survive a desperate situation. They fought like a species that had already decided the outcome before the first shot was fired, and was simply making the universe conform to the decision. The debris field spread across thousands of kilometers of space, glowing with residual heat, and dotted with scattered fires that burned until their oxygen ran out. Among the wreckage, emergency beacons from Dravari escape pods began to flash, small, pulsing lights in the dark, like my distress beacon had pulsed before I turned it off. The Oathkeeper, still moving, still functional despite damage that should have killed it twice over, began scanning the debris field, marking positions, cataloging the emergency beacons. It was recording the locations of the Dravari escape pods so that rescue ships could find them later. The humans had just shattered a fleet that was hunting refugees for forced labor. They had just fought a battle that would be talked about for generations. And now, before the fires in the wreckage had even gone out, they were making sure that the enemy's survivors would be found. I watched it on the sensor display, moving slowly now, trailing streamers of debris and venting atmosphere from more hull breaches than I could count. It was battered, scarred, half-broken. One of the most devastating weapons I had ever witnessed, reduced to a limping, bleeding wreck that looked like it might come apart with one more hard turn. The communications array chimed. I opened the channel with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Not because I was calm, because I was past shaking. I was in a place beyond fear, beyond relief, beyond anything I had a name for. Captain Elliot's voice. Steady, calm, unchanged. As if the last 11 minutes had been routine, had been nothing special, had been just another day. Convoy Whisper of Dawn. Threat neutralized. You are safe. We will escort you the rest of the way. I tried to respond. I could not. My throat closed. My bioluminescence erupted in every color I possessed at once. cycling through the full spectrum in waves that I could not control. A cascade of light that the Rathani body produces when the mind is overwhelmed, when emotion exceeds the capacity of thought, when you feel something so large that your body has to express it because your words cannot. Suli was crying openly at her station, her tears catching the light of her own bioluminescence and glowing as they fell. Torath was standing at the viewport, his skin blazing with pure gold, a color that Rathani produce so rarely that most of us go our entire lives without seeing it. And on the decks below, in the cargo holds, 40,000 refugees were watching their view screens, and the convoy was lighting up, ship by ship, as the bioluminescence of an entire species ignited in a single, wordless response to what they had just witnessed. It came out as a whisper. "Thank you, Oathkeeper." A pause. Then Captain Elliot, in a tone that carried the faintest, warmest trace of something I could only call kindness. "You are welcome, Whisper of Dawn. Now let us get your people somewhere safe." 3 days later, the convoy was still moving through the pale corridor, but everything had changed. The Oathkeeper flew escort alongside us, battered and scarred, its damaged hull patched with raw metal plates that had been welded directly over the wounds. It was not pretty work. It was not elegant. It was functional. And for the humans, I think he was worried that seeing the humans up close would change something fundamental in my understanding of the galaxy. He was right to worry. The shuttle docked at one of the Oathkeeper's secondary bays, a cavernous space that smelled of hot metal and chemical sealant, and the sharp ozone tang of recent welding. A human officer met me at the airlock. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with short dark hair, and a face that looked like it had been through a few fights, and come out the other side with stories to tell. His name was Daniel Marsh, the ship's first officer. He extended his hand. Humans do this as a greeting, gripping each other's hands and moving them up and down. It is a peculiar custom, but when Daniel Marsh took my hand, he was careful, gentle. He adjusted his grip for the difference in our bone density without being asked, and his eyes were warm. "Welcome aboard the Oathkeeper," he said. "Can I get you anything? Water, food, a place to rest?" I told him I was fine. He nodded, and led me into the ship. The corridors of the Oathkeeper told a story that no official report could capture. The ship was old, not old in the way of a museum piece, preserved and polished and kept behind glass, old in the way of a tool that has been used hard and used well for many years. The walls were clean but scarred, marked by repairs that went back years, maybe decades. I saw welding lines where hull breaches had been sealed in previous battles, the metal smooth but slightly discolored. I saw replacement panels in different shades of gray, patches covering older patches. A layered record of damage and repair, and damage again, that spoke of a ship and a crew that had been through this before. Many times before. This was not the Oathkeeper's first battle. It was not its 10th. Daniel Marsh walked me through the ship's main corridor, and I passed crew members. Humans. Dozens of them. They were not what I had expected. I had imagined soldiers, grim and hard and moving with mechanical efficiency. I had imagined the kind of beings who could destroy a fleet in 11 minutes, cold and focused and slightly frightening. What I found were people. Some of them were repairing battle damage in the corridors, welding and hammering and cutting with their bare hands, their uniforms stained with grease and sweat. One woman was balanced on top of a structural beam, holding a welding torch in one hand and a sandwich in the other, somehow managing both at once. Others were sitting in small groups, talking, laughing, arguing about things I could not follow. One group was gathered around a small screen, watching something that made them shout and gesture with intense excitement. I later learned it was a recording of a sporting event from their homeworld. A medic was treating a crew member who had burns on his forearms. She was humming as she worked, a soft melody that echoed in the metal corridor, and filled the space with a gentleness that seemed impossible on a warship. They were diverse in a way that startled me. Different skin colors, different heights, different builds, different textures of hair. Some were large and heavily muscled. Some were small and fine-boned. Their voices carried different accents and rhythms. They looked like a species that had taken every possible variation of itself and thrown them all together and dared them to work as a unit. And somehow, impossibly, they did. A young woman with red hair and a bandaged forehead stopped in the corridor when she saw me. She looked at me with wide eyes, taking in my height, my slender build, the soft glow of my bioluminescence in the dim corridor light. Then she smiled, a wide, unguarded, spontaneous smile that lit up her entire face. "You are Rithani?" she asked. I said yes. "You are beautiful," she said. Then she seemed to realize what she had said, and color flooded her face, a reddening of the cheeks that I later learned was the human equivalent of an involuntary emotional display, and she hurried away down the corridor. I stood there for a moment, my skin glowing warm amber. She had said it as if it were simply true, as if beauty were a gift you could hand to a stranger in passing, weightless and free, costing nothing to give. Daniel Marsh brought me to the captain's quarters and left me at the door. Captain Grace Elliott was not what I expected. She was small by human standards, shorter than most of her crew, with threads of gray in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years of decisions and their consequences. Her quarters were sparse: a desk, a chair, a shelf with a few personal items, a photograph of 2 children, a small round stone, smooth and dark, a book with a cracked spine and worn pages. The room smelled faintly of something warm and bitter that I later learned was called coffee. She stood when I entered. She shook my hand with a grip that was firm but careful. "Vayan Shokar," she said. "I have been wanting to meet you." I delivered the council's formal thanks, the traditional words, the ancient phrases of gratitude that Rithani have spoken for thousands of years, when one people owes its existence to another. Grace Elliott listened with patience and respect, nodding at the appropriate moments, giving the ritual the attention it deserved. I told her that the Rathani species profile was available in the Galactic database if she wished to review our demographics and capabilities. She shook her head. I do not want a file, I want to know about them. The 40,000 people on your convoy. Tell me about them. What do they do? What are they good at? What do they care about? What do they love? Nobody had ever asked me that. Not the Halori, who had expressed their deep concern. Not the Juan, who had calculated our economic value. Not the Valesi, who had apologized for being unable to help. They had asked about our strategic significance, our resource output, our population statistics. Grace Elliott, who had just risked her ship and her crew and her career to save us, wanted to know what we loved. I told her about the resonance, about the way Rathani voices blend together in harmonics that no single throat can produce, creating music that is not just heard but felt, vibrations that resonate in the listener's body regardless of their species. I told her about our scientists, who map the deep gravitational currents between galaxies with a patience that other species find incomprehensible. I told her about our children, who learn to sing before they learn to speak, whose first words are always musical notes, always a melody hummed in the arms of a parent. She listened to all of it. She asked questions. She wanted names, not numbers, names. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "We have already contacted our civilian aid organizations. Medical supplies and food will be waiting for your people at New Keswick. It is a colony world in our territory. Your people will have temporary asylum there for as long as they need it." I stared at her. "You arranged this already?" "During the engagement," she said, without emphasis, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. While the Oathkeeper was taking fire from 5 cruisers, while armor was being stripped from the hull and compartments were blowing out into vacuum, and crew members were being thrown from their stations by impacts, someone on this ship had been sitting at a console, filing aid requests and refugee asylum paperwork. They had been fighting for their lives and processing humanitarian logistics at the same time. "We fight hard, Vayon," Captain Elliott said, reading the confusion on my bioluminescent skin. "But we do not fight for the joy of it. We fight so that what needs to happen after the fighting can happen. The paperwork matters as much as the railguns, maybe more." She gave me a tour of the ship. She showed me the engine room, where engineers were performing repairs that should have taken a dockyard weeks, and were completing them in days, working in shifts around the clock, sleeping on the floor next to the equipment they were fixing. She showed me the medical bay, where the wounded were being treated with a competence and a compassion that reminded me of our own healers. She showed me the mess hall, where off-duty crew were eating and arguing about something called football, with a passion that seemed entirely disproportionate to the stakes of the disagreement. In the engine room, a large man named Oliver Pratt, whose hands were nearly the size of my head, was teaching a younger crew member to play a musical instrument, a small wooden thing with strings that he plucked with his thick fingers. The sound was gentle and sweet, completely at odds with the size of the man producing it, and it echoed through the bay like sunlight through water. but he tries every day. I respect that. The younger man played a sour note, and they both laughed, and the laughter echoed alongside the music. And for a moment, standing in the engine room of a battleship that still smelled of smoke and sealant, I forgot that I was on a warship at all. On my way back to the shuttle bay, I passed through the observation lounge. It was a small room at the rear of the ship, a quiet space with a wide viewport that looked out at the stars and, beyond them, the running lights of the convoy. The 12 Rethani ships drifted in formation, their navigation beacons glowing softly in the dark. A woman was sitting alone by the viewport. She was young, with short blonde hair and bandages on both arms that covered burns she had received during the battle. She was staring out at the convoy with an expression that I could not easily read. Humans have so many muscles in their faces, and they use them in combinations that do not map neatly onto Rethani emotional categories. She asked. I said yes. She struggled with something for a moment. I could see the effort on her face, the way she was searching for words, trying to reach across the gap between our species, with nothing but syllables and good intentions. Then she spoke, slowly, carefully, in badly pronounced Rethani. She had clearly learned the words recently, probably in the last 3 days, memorizing the sounds from a translation guide without fully understanding the grammar. Your children, they are safe? I told her yes, the children were safe. She nodded, and then her eyes filled with liquid, tears, the human involuntary response to overwhelming emotion. The moisture gathered and spilled down her cheeks, and she did not wipe it away. She just stood there, this young warrior with burns on her arms, crying in the observation lounge of a battleship, because the children of a species she had never met were safe. She was not crying from pain, though she must have been in pain. She was not crying from exhaustion, though she must have been exhausted. She was crying because the answer to her question was yes, because the children were safe. And that fact, that single piece of information about the well-being of strangers, moved her so deeply that her body could not contain it. I stood there with her for a long time, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a reorganization of categories that I had carried my entire life. The galaxy has a system for classifying species, builders and destroyers, thinkers and fighters, gentle and dangerous. You are one thing or the other. The humans are both. They are all of these things at once, held together in a combination that should be impossible, but is not. They will fight with a fury that freezes your blood, and then cry because children are safe. No political leverage, no alliance. Why did you come? Why did you risk your ship and your people for a species you have never met? Grace Elliott looked at me for a long time. Her expression was quiet, thoughtful, carrying a weight that I could feel but not fully understand. Because you called for help, she said, and we could hear you. I waited for more. Because you called for help, and we could hear you. I wrote the first line. We were wrong about them. Everyone was. 3 months later, I was standing in a park on a world called New Keswick, watching Rathani children play with human children, under a sky that was the wrong color. New Keswick's sky trends more green than blue, tinted by trace gases in the atmosphere that give everything a warm, golden-green quality. The colony is small by human standards, 100,000 people spread across a coastal settlement of white-walled buildings, and wide streets lined with trees that have no Rithani names. The humans had given us our own district, a cluster of housing blocks near the ocean that they built in 6 weeks, using prefabricated structures, modules that arrived in shipping containers and unfolded into homes with plumbing and heating and windows that faced the sea. I was working as a cultural liaison between the Rethani community and our human hosts. The job was mostly translation, and not just of words. The humans kept trying to give us things: furniture, clothing, medical equipment, food that they had researched to ensure was compatible with our biology, educational materials for the children, translated into Rithani by volunteers who had taught themselves our language from databases and dictionaries and long conversations with patient Rithani tutors. They were not doing any of this out of obligation. There was no treaty, no aid agreement, no formal framework. They were doing it because they wanted to, because it seemed obvious to them that when people need help, you help them. A woman named Sophie Ward, who ran the colony's Community Services Division, told me that 14 different civilian organizations had volunteered to sponsor Rithani families within a week of our arrival. She had to turn some of them away because there were more volunteers than refugees who needed sponsors. I did not know how to explain to her that in my experience of the galaxy, this was unprecedented. This was not how interspecies relations worked. Nobody gave this much to strangers who could give nothing in return. It violated every model of galactic behavior I had been trained to understand. Sophie looked at me with a confused expression and said, "We are neighbors now. What else would we do?" The humans had built it because a civil engineer named Nathan Cole noticed that there was no green space in the settlement plans. Rithani children need open sky and natural light for healthy neurological development. Nobody had told Nathan this. Nobody had filed a request. He had simply looked at the plans, realized what was missing, and added a park. When I asked him why, he shrugged and said, "Kids need a place to run around." The children were playing. The Rithani children were taller, slender, their skin shimmering with soft, shifting colors as they moved through the golden light. The human children were shorter, louder, and apparently incapable of remaining still for more than a few seconds at a time. They were teaching the Rithani children a game. The game involved one child chasing the others. When the chaser touched someone, that person became the new chaser. There were no points. There was no winner. The entire purpose of the game was the chase itself, the running, the laughing, the breathless and joyful panic of being pursued by someone who meant you no harm. For the Rithani, pursuit has only ever meant one thing. It is what predators do. It is what the Dravari did to us. The idea of running after someone for fun, of chasing, and being chased as an act of joy rather than fear, was something our culture had never conceived. But the children were learning. A small Rithani girl named Leah, 6 years old, her skin shimmering with excited blues and greens, was being chased by a human boy who was at least a head shorter than her and 3 times as loud. In the cargo holds of the Whisper of Dawn, during those 6 terrible days of flight, Leah had not spoken. Not one word. She had sat in her mother's arms with her bioluminescence completely dark and her eyes empty, a small child who understood exactly enough of what was happening to be terrified into silence. She had been one of the quiet ones, the children whose fear went so deep that it took their voices away. Now she was laughing, running and glowing with colors that I had never seen a child her age produce. Brilliant cascades of blue and green and gold that rippled across her skin like sunlight on water. The human boy chasing her could not catch her. Rithani children are fast, faster than human children. And Leah was quick even by our standards. But he kept trying. He kept running after her, red-faced and panting, his short legs pumping, his arms waving. Every time he got close, Leah shrieked with pure delight and darted away, and her bioluminescence flared so brightly that she looked like a small star sprinting across the grass. The sound of her laughter made my skin glow so brightly that a passing human woman stopped and asked me with genuine concern if I was all right. I told her I was fine. I sat down on a bench and opened my personal log. The story of the pale corridor had spread across the galaxy in the 3 months since it happened. I had not spread it. I did not need to. Stories like this have their own velocity. They move through communication networks and diplomatic channels, and casual conversations and intercepted signals, and whispered rumors, finding every gap, filling every silence, reaching places that official reports never touch. The Dravari Dominion filed a formal protest with the Galactic Concord within days of the battle. They accused humanity of unprovoked aggression against a sovereign military operation. They cited galactic law, precedent, and the principle of non-interference. They demanded reparations for the lost vessels and the lost crews. They demanded the surrender of Captain Grace Elliott for trial before a galactic tribunal. The human diplomatic response arrived 3 days later. It was delivered by a human ambassador named Margaret Hale, a woman with silver hair and an expression that gave nothing away. regarding the demand for the surrender of Captain Elliot, come and get her. Those 4 words echoed through the galactic concord like a thunderclap in a quiet room. The established powers did not know what to make of the humans. The Halori Concord was uncomfortable. The Juan Trade League was nervous. The Valesi Commonwealth was silent, which was their specialty. The humans had broken every rule of galactic engagement. They had intervened without authorization. They had engaged a foreign military force without a declaration of hostility, without a treaty obligation, without any legal basis that the existing frameworks could accommodate. They had acted unilaterally, violently, and without a trace of apology. And yet, 40,000 Rathani were alive because of it. That number sat in the middle of every diplomatic argument, like a weight that nobody could lift, a fact that no amount of legal reasoning could make disappear. 40,000 people who would have been taken into slavery were instead living in prefabricated houses near the ocean on New Keswick, eating food that humans had donated, sleeping under blankets that human volunteers had sewn, sending their children to a park that a human engineer had built because he thought kids needed a place to run around. The math was uncomfortable. The morality was clear. I began receiving messages from other species within weeks of the story spreading. Small civilizations. Vulnerable ones. Species that existed at the margins of galactic power, too weak to defend themselves, too small to matter in the calculations of great empires, too afraid to ask for help because their entire history had taught them that the answer would always be no. They wanted to know about the humans. They wanted to know if the stories were true. A message arrived from a species called the Tithani, who lived under the economic domination of the Junim. Their homeworld produced rare minerals that the June extracted under contracts that left the Tithani with almost nothing. They had been trying to renegotiate for decades. They had been ignored for decades. Their message to me contained a single question. Did the humans really come when no one else would? I told them yes. The messages multiplied. Species I had never heard of. Civilizations from distant sectors of the galactic arm, all of them asking the same question in different words, in different languages, with different levels of hope and skepticism, but always the same question underneath. Is it true? Are there really beings out there who will fight for strangers, who will cross 6 days of empty space because they heard a cry for help, who will charge 7 warships alone because someone somewhere needed them? They are loud and baffling, and they play music during battles, and they cry when children are safe, and they file humanitarian paperwork while their ship is being shot to pieces, and they build parks because kids need to run around. 2 months after our arrival on New Keswick, I attended a session of the Galactic Concord as a Rathani observer. The session had been called to formally address the Dravari protest regarding human actions in the Pale Corridor. The chamber was packed to capacity. Every major species had sent full delegations. The observation galleries were standing room only. The mood was tense, electric, charged with the awareness that something consequential was about to happen. The Dravari ambassador spoke first. He was tall, armored, his mandibles clicking with the precise rhythm of prepared remarks. He delivered a comprehensive indictment of human actions. He cited 17 different articles of galactic law. He cited precedent from 6 previous interspecies conflicts. He cited the principle of sovereign military autonomy, the bedrock rule that no species could unilaterally interfere in another's internal military operations. He spoke for 40 minutes, and every word was carefully chosen to make the humans look like dangerous radicals who threatened the stability of the galactic order. Several representatives from other species spoke in support. The humans had set a dangerous precedent. If one species could decide, on its own, to intervene militarily in another's operations, where would it end? The system was built on restraint, on protocol, on the understanding that nations, however much they might disagree, did not simply attack each other. The humans had shattered that understanding, and the cracks would spread if nothing was done. These arguments were reasonable, they were logical, they were entirely correct in their own frame of reference. Then, Ambassador Margaret Hale stood. She was not imposing. She was average height for a human, dressed simply, her silver hair pulled back. She carried no data pads, no prepared remarks, no visual aids. She stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives of 100 civilizations, and she waited. The chamber fell silent. Not because she demanded silence, because something in the way she stood, something in the quality of her stillness, made every being in that room want to hear what she was about to say. She spoke plainly, simple words, short sentences, no flourishes, no rhetoric, no legal citations. She said that humanity recognized the right of every species to govern itself. She said that humans had no interest in building an empire. She said that they were a young species, still learning, still finding their way in a galaxy that was very old and very complicated, and they knew they had much to learn. And then she said this. It was a line before we left our homeworld, before we built our first ship, before we knew that other species existed. It is part of what we are. Every species that crosses that line will meet what the Dravari met in the Pale Corridor. And if you believe that the number of your ships or the size of your territory will change that outcome, I would encourage you to reconsider. The Dravari ambassador began to respond. He got through exactly 2 sentences before Margaret Hale raised one hand, a small gesture, almost casual, and spoke over him. She did it politely. She even smiled. "We are not finished," she said. "Your fleet captain called the Rathani cargo. 40,000 sentient beings, mothers and fathers and children and poets and scientists, and he called them cargo. I want this chamber to sit with that word for a moment." She let the silence stretch. "And I want every representative here to ask themselves one question. If it were your people in those ships, if it were your children in those cargo holds, would you want someone to come?" She paused again. "And if someone came, would you tell them they were wrong?" She gathered her notes, though she had none to gather, and stepped away from the podium. The session ended without a vote. There was nothing to vote on. In the weeks that followed, the Dravari quietly withdrew their formal complaint. No sanctions were issued against humanity. No reparations were demanded. The Pale Corridor incident was filed in the Concord's records under the bland heading of Interspecies Dispute, resolved informally. And quietly, without fanfare, without press releases or official announcements, a number of small species began reaching out to the Terran government. They did not want military alliances. The humans did not seem interested in those anyway. They wanted something more personal, something that the galactic system did not have a formal category for. A connection, a promise, a relationship built on the simple, radical, apparently revolutionary idea that if you called for help, someone would answer. Captain Grace Elliott had been officially reprimanded by the Terran Naval Command for engaging a foreign military force without authorization. The reprimand was entered into her service record with all appropriate formality and gravity. She was then privately promoted to Commodore. The Oathkeeper was now patrolling the Pale Corridor full-time, accompanied by 2 additional warships that had been assigned to the region. The stretch of empty space, where 40,000 Rathani had nearly been taken into slavery, was no longer unpatrolled territory. It was no longer dark. The humans had decided that it mattered, and so they had claimed it. Not as territory, not as a possession, as a responsibility. The human boy was still chasing her, red-faced, breathless, grinning so widely that it looked like his face might split in half. He could not catch her, but he was not going to stop trying. Around them, other children played. Rathani and human, mixed together, inventing new games that neither species could have conceived alone. A tall Rathani boy was teaching a group of human girls to make their skin glow in patterns, and they were trying, pressing their hands against his, and watching with delighted frustration as nothing happened. A human girl was teaching a young Rathani how to throw a ball, demonstrating the motion over and over with patient repetition, while the Rathani child, who had never held a ball before, threw it sideways and backwards, and once straight up into the air, where it hit a tree branch and bounced away, and both of them collapsed laughing. An older human man sat down on the bench next to me. He had white hair and kind eyes and weathered hands, and he watched the children with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to know what matters. "No," I said, "but she is ours." He nodded, as if he understood exactly what I meant, and I think he did. I opened my personal log. I had been writing this entry for 3 months, adding to it piece by piece, searching for the right words. The Rathani language has over 400 words for different qualities of light. We have 12 words for the color blue, 17 for the specific way light moves through water. We are not a species that lacks vocabulary, but I lacked vocabulary for this. I tried anyway, because the words need to exist even if they are imperfect, because someone, someday, might read them and understand, because the Rathani keep records, and this is a record that must be kept. A young species that does not know its place, that does not respect the rules, that acts on impulse rather than calculation, and they are all of these things. I have watched them fight, and I can tell you that there is nothing in this galaxy more terrifying than a human warship at close range. They do not stop. They do not yield. They do not care what happens to their own hull as long as they can keep hitting you. They will roll their ship to show you fresh armor, and put a railgun slug through your engine room, while someone on their bridge plays music. But I have also watched them build parks for children they have never met. I have watched them learn 3 words of a foreign language so they could ask if the children were safe. I have watched a woman with burns on her arms cry in an observation lounge because the answer was yes. I have watched them argue about football and teach each other music and file refugee paperwork while their ship was being torn apart around them. And I will tell you what the Dravari learned in the Pale Corridor. What every tyrant in every system, in every arm of every galaxy, will learn eventually. It is a simple lesson. It fits in a single breath. Humans do not ask permission to do what is right. And if you hunt the helpless, if you prey upon the small, if you look at a convoy of 40,000 refugees and see nothing but cargo, if you sit in your warship and refuse the surrender of people who are begging you for mercy, if you believe that no one is coming to stop you, because no one has ever come before, and no one ever will, then I have one thing to tell you. You are wrong. They are already on their way. They heard you the moment you crossed the line, and they have been coming ever since, burning across the empty space between your cruelty and their conscience, and they are not going to stop. They are loading their railguns and filing their paperwork and playing their music, and they are coming for you with their wrath and their kindness in equal measure, and you are not ready. You will never be ready, because you do not understand what you are facing. You are facing a species that fights like the universe is ending, and loves like it is just beginning. and they do not leave their beacons off. I closed the log. I looked up at the green-tinted sky of New Keswick, and I listened to the sound of children laughing, Rithani, and human voices tangled together, inseparable, and I let my bioluminescence do what it wanted to do. It glowed gold. Bright, steady, unshakable gold. In the Rithani spectrum, gold is the color of something we almost never feel. It is not joy exactly, though joy is part of it. It is not relief, though relief is there too. It is something larger than either of those, something that contains them both, and exceeds them both. It is the color of being safe, truly, deeply, fundamentally safe. Not because the danger is gone, but because someone is standing between you and the dark, and they have no intention of moving. And somewhere out in the pale corridor, far from here but not too far, not anymore, never too far again, a battered human battleship was keeping watch over the emptiness, making sure that no cry would go unanswered, that no beacon would pulse in vain, that no species, anywhere, would ever have to learn the taste of silence again. The beacon was on, someone was listening, and for the first time in my life, I was not afraid of the dark.